Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on robbery to a criminal law scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at the Dan and the old lady mini scenario. We're going to recap the law on robbery so we can pull out the issues from this scenario, and we're going to use the idea structure to look at how we'd get a really nice written answer to this for use in the exam. Robbery scenarios are a little bit challenging to do because you need to remember that for there to be a robbery, there must first have been a completed theft. So it's quite challenging to write out an answer on these types of scenarios because you're going to have to apply both theft and the elements of robbery in order to get a good answer. But we're going to break that all down today and look at exactly how you would tackle that. As always then, let's start by looking at the scenario that we've been given. So our situation is this: Dan taps an elderly lady on the arm to attract her attention and asks directions to the town centre. While she is pointing and her attention is distracted, he removes her purse from her bag without her noticing. Dan decides to steal a bottle of wine from the off-licence. He hides the wine under his coat, but he's spotted by the shopkeeper who tries to stop him leaving, so Dan trips him over, causing the shopkeeper to break his leg. And you're being asked to discuss Dan's liability. And we can see here that in this scenario there's actually two issues, so I'll highlight them for us. There's the issue with the old lady and her purse, and there's also the issue of this bottle of wine from the off-licence. And you're being asked to advise Dan on these two issues. And this question doesn't specify advise him on robbery, it's just saying discuss his liability. So in the exam, you would have had to have looked at that and recognised, it's robbery we're looking for here. So let's just have a refresher then on what the law on robbery is so that we can see whether he's going to be liable for robbery for these two issues. On this slide, we've got a summary of robbery, and there's quite a lot to this crime. So I do recommend that before you start trying to apply the law on robbery, it would be a good idea to go and look at my previous video tutorials, the one that's just on theft, and also the one that's just on robbery, so that you can refresh all the law before you come to try and apply it. Okay, so those videos go over all of the cases, all of the definitions in detail. We've only got time for a quick recap here before we start looking at our scenario. Our definition of robbery, if you remember, comes from the Theft Act, Section 8. Remember, Section 1 is theft, Section 8 is robbery. And the definition of robbery is that we need a completed theft plus force or threat of force before or at the time of the theft in order to steal, and the mens rea is dishonest intention to permanently deprive, and they must have the intention to use the force in order to steal. What makes robbery a little bit complicated is the fact that you have to have a completed theft plus these other elements. So you have to know the law on theft really, really well to get a good answer to a robbery scenario. And that's why I advise you to go away and look at the theft video tutorial again as a bit of a refresher before you try to do this. So the actus reus of robbery then, completed theft, I've put in blue font here that these are the elements of theft, and we need all of them for there to be a robbery. So we need appropriation of property belonging to another with dishonest intention to permanently deprive. If any of those elements at all are missing, it cannot be a robbery, even if it otherwise looks like a robbery. And that's illustrated quite nicely by Robinson, if you remember. In that case, the defendant saw a man whose wife owed him £7. So the defendant goes up to the man and starts saying, your wife owes me £7. They get into a bit of an argument. There's a bit of a scuffle in which the victim drops a fiver on the floor. The defendant picks up the fiver thinking, well, he owes me £7, so that fiver is mine, and he walks off. And then he's being prosecuted for a robbery because there's some force in the scuffle, And the victim is saying, well, there's also a theft because he took the £5. So I've got a theft of the £5 plus the force, so it's a robbery. But if you remember, that couldn't be a robbery because one of these elements of theft was not present, and it was dishonesty. The defendant was not dishonest because he was able to argue 2-1A, reasonable belief in legal right to the property. In other words, because he was owed £7 by this man, he genuinely believed the fiver on the floor was his. So because there wasn't all the elements of a theft, there couldn't be a robbery. So whenever you're trying to apply the law on robbery, you have to go through each element and check that you've got everything for a theft before you then consider the next actus reus elements for it to be a robbery. So once you've got what looks like a theft, you then need to check that there was force or the threat of force before or at the time of the theft and in order to steal. And we looked at a number of cases on all of these. We won't go through them all here, but remember that there only has to be a slight amount of force, but we do have that issue with P and the DPP where the defendant slipped or slid, I should say, a cigarette out of the victim's hand without really touching it. There was said to be not enough or no contact there, so it couldn't be a robbery. That case sort of crops up quite a lot in scenarios, and we're actually going to see it in the Dan one. So there's our cases on force or threat of force. So that's our actus reus, completed theft, plus force or threat of force before or at the time of the theft in order to steal. And our mens rea, we have to have dishonest intention to permanently deprive. So that's the mens rea for theft. And they must have the intention to use the force in order to steal. So if you recall when we talked about that in class, it might be that I'm annoyed with a student and I punch them in the face, they fall off the chair, and then a pound coin rolls out of their pocket. And I go, ooh, that's handy. Pick up the pound so I can go and get some Haribo. In that situation, that wouldn't be a robbery. That would be a battery plus a theft, because when I took that pound, it was just, I just saw it at that particular moment. I didn't punch him in order to steal. I didn't even know that he had a pound in his pocket. So you've got to be sure that this force or threat of force was done with the very purpose of stealing. Okay, so there's quite a lot to robbery there. So I actually find it's quite useful to have a checklist. And when I'm looking at a scenario, I sort of go through this checklist in my mind and I think, have we got an appropriation? Have we got property? Did it belong to another? Was the defendant dishonest? Did they have intention to permanently deprive? Did they use force? I should say, or threat of force. And was it before or at the time of the theft and in order to steal? So going through this checklist, and if you've got all of them, you've got a robbery. So what we're going to do now that this is fresh in our minds is we're going to go back to the Dan scenario and see if we meet all these elements in his situation. So here we are, back to Dan then. And remember, in this one, we've got two issues, okay? We've got the old lady and we've got the bottle of wine. Now, when you've got multiple issues like this in a scenario, you need to just concentrate on one at a time. And I suggest that you do them in the order that they happened in the scenario so you don't get in a muddle. So forget about the wine for now and let's focus on what happened with the old lady. So firstly, in order to see if there was a robbery on this old lady, we need to decide, was there an appropriation? And there is, because we can see here he removes her purse. So we've got appropriation. Have we got property? Yep, definitely, because a purse would be property. Did it belong to another? Yep, definitely, it belonged to the old lady. Was he dishonest? Yeah, definitely dishonest to be removing a purse from a bag. Did he have intention to permanently deprive? Yes, presumably he's not planning on returning it. So we've got the completed theft there. Our next issue is, have we got force or the threat of force before or at the time of that theft in order to steal. And that's where we might have a problem here. He taps the lady on the arm. Now, we could say that that is force because he's touching her. And remember from Dawson and James, the force can be slight. So we've got force before the theft, potentially. But we would need to discuss the fact that he does remove the purse from her bag without her noticing. And the case that should come to mind here is P in the DPP, where the cigarette was slid out of the victim's hand. No real force was used. So we'd need to have a discussion about whether there's enough force there. But I think perhaps with the slight touching, it might be enough to make it a robbery. Our second issue is the wine. So have we got appropriation? Yep, because he hides it under his coat. So he's appropriating property at that point. Wine is property. It belongs to the off licence. It's clearly a dishonest thing to do. He clearly intended to permanently deprive. So again, we seem to have a completed theft. But before the theft is completed totally, he's spotted by the shopkeeper, who tries to stop him. So Dan trips him over. Now this, hopefully, cases spring to mind here, the case of Hale and the case of Lockley. Because what we've actually got here when you look at it is force, because he trips him over. But actually the force happens after the theft. And our actus reus is force before or at the time of the theft. But we can use Hale and Lockley here to say that actually the theft is still continuing when this force occurs. So we do have a robbery here. So now that we know that we've got two potential robberies and we're happy with those, how do we apply it to a scenario using IDEA? And that's what I'll show you on the next slide. So we always use IDEA. We identify, define, explain, and apply. So you identify that Dan might be liable for robbery when he taps the old lady and takes her purse and he takes the wine from the off licence. Define robbery, actus reus, mens rea, and then you explain the actus reus and mens rea with all of your cases. But I've put here to remind you, the actus reus is green, the mens rea is purple. So for your actus reus, you need to do the 5 elements of theft first with all of your cases. Now you're going to have to be quite concise here. So you'd say appropriation, assuming any rights of the owner, Pitman, Hiel, Morris, etc. Just put them in brackets. Property includes ... Yeah, so be quite succinct, but go through all 5 elements. And then say you need force or threat of force and go through your cases such as Dawson and James, P and the DPP, etc. there. And then explain your mens rea. And then for application, you need to go through every element of the actus reus. So using that checklist. So I'll just quickly switch back to it. When you're applying, say whether there was an appropriation, say whether there was property belonging to another, etc. Go through every element. And once you've dealt with the actus reus elements, make sure that you also do the mens rea elements as well. I've done a bullet point mark scheme for this dance scenario. I'm sorry it's a bit small. It was so I could fit it on one slide. I'm also running out of time on this recording, so it might be a good idea for you to pause the video so that you can have a good read through. As always, mine's very bullet pointy. You will write in full sentences in the exam. You can see here, though, how I've gone through in my explanation. I've explained all the elements of theft with all my theft cases before I've got onto the bits that are specific to robbery. And you can see in my application, I've separated out how I've applied the law on the purse from the old lady and how I've applied the law on the issue with the wine. Again, mine's very bullet pointy, but it does show you the correct order and the issues that you should have in there. So I hope that was helpful. Have a go, use an idea on other robbery scenarios that you have.